Hey everyone, Teo here. Today we are going to find out how you can use watercolor paper that has deteriorated sizing. When we talk about sizing with watercolor paper, we are not talking about how big or small the paper is. We are actually talking about how the paper is treated to handle water. Sizing is the application of gelatin either internally or on the surface of watercolor paper to affect how much paint and water the paper can absorb. Sizing is one of two main factors that affect the quality of watercolor paper. So with good sizing, you can achieve soft color blends like this, and also watercolor paint will appear more vibrant on the paper. The other factor that affects quality of the watercolor paper is cotton content. However, in my opinion, sizing is actually more important compared to cotton content because sizing affects how water and paint moves and react on the paper. If you take a look at this watercolor sketchbook that I have kept for way too long, the sizing has deteriorated because the gelatin has reacted with the high humidity here in Singapore. So when sizing is gone or almost gone and you have watercolor on the paper, it's going to create this weird texture that looks unnatural and draws unwanted attention. If you compare this paper with proper sizing and this paper with deteriorated sizing, you can definitely see the difference. There is this weird texture on the paper that you don't find here. If you know you're someone who doesn't paint that often or use up watercolor paper that quickly, try not to stock up on watercolor paper even if there is a good sale, because once the paper sizing has deteriorated, there is no way to restore the paper back to its original condition or quality. Years ago, I actually made a review for the Daniel Smith watercolor ground that you can paint on paper to sort of restore the sizing. But even so, you will not get back the original paper quality. So now that the paper sizing has gone bad for this paper, what can you do with the paper that no longer works well with watercolor? Right, before we start testing, let me show you a sneak peek of the results. So obviously dry media will work the best, such as crayons, wax pastels, colored pencils. Gouache can work provided you use enough paint to cover the paper texture. Paint markers can work. Gel ink works fine. Liquid ink does not work because it's liquid. Alcohol markers can work, but alcohol markers do not work well on watercolor paper anyway. Let's test ink on paper. This is liquid ink. Now, when I tested some paper with deteriorated sizing, sometimes the ink would feather, and that can happen with liquid ink. I can actually see slight feathering, so I'm going to have my pen rest here for a while to see if the ink will spread. On good paper, the ink will not spread. And this seems fine, thankfully. Now, even though I do not see much feathering, I can see the lines are actually thicker than usual, because when I use this pen on another paper, the lines are actually slightly thinner. So yes, the sizing does affect liquid ink. This is a Sailor fountain pen with a zoom nib that I use quite regularly for drawing, so I know that the lines here are actually slightly thicker than usual because of the deteriorated paper sizing. Next, I'm going to use this pen with gel ink. So I'm going to draw the same thing. From what I can see so far, the ink does not feather. So gel ink actually performs slightly better than the liquid ink. And this is actually a roller boss, so you can see the ink blobs at the start and end of the lines, which I kind of like. So gel ink actually performs fine, performs alright on this paper. Because the paper sizing has deteriorated, you have to do a lot of tests to see what can work with the paper. Let's try a brush pen, and this is obviously using liquid ink. I don't usually draw with a brush pen, so this is kind of challenging for me. So as I lay down the line, I can sort of see and also feel the ink spreading, which is not surprising because this is liquid ink, and without the sizing, liquid or water is not going to work well on the paper. You can see the feathering with all the strokes. So this does not look nice. Next we have colored pencils, and since this is dry media, obviously this is going to work very well. This looks fine. So depending on how smooth or rough the watercolor paper is, you can actually use colored pencils, and they work really well on this smoother paper that I have here. Next, let's test this Sharpie marker. Okay, I'm going to rest a pen tip on the paper surface. So here you can see the ink actually would feather, but that is to be expected with Sharpie markers. If you work fast enough, it looks fine. By the way, this black ink is not archival, so the black ink will actually fade with time. Sharpie markers or alcohol markers don't work well on watercolor paper anyway. This is a pigment liner or multi-liner. I'm not sure if this is using alcohol ink, but the ink is pigmented. Let's have the pen rest here for a few seconds and see whether or not the ink will bleed or feather. And this is pretty good. This did not feather like the Sharpie marker. So if you want to, you can actually draw on this paper with pigmented multi-liners or fine liners, or technical pens that use pigmented ink. So the lines are quite precise. No issues with multi-liners. This is alcohol marker over the Sharpie. And this is over the pigment liner. Oops. Okay. Some issues here. Even though the line art was created quite a long time ago and there is a lot of time for the ink to dry, I can see the ink reacting to the alcohol marker. And Sharpie is supposed to be permanent, as in the ink will not move on paper once the ink is down, but here I can see some reaction. Here you can see the Sharpie lines feather slightly, and also this black ink is not 100% black. And with the pigment liner, you can see the ink is not completely dry for some reason. That's the Winsor & Newton pigment liner, by the way. Yeah, so if the ink does not dry and you have marker over it, it's going to look like this. It's going to smear or smudge the ink. Next we have acrylic paint markers, and this works fine. I don't see any feathering. And that is not surprising because this is, well, not water-based markers. So acrylic works fine. Let's try gouache. So this is water-based. I can see the weird paper texture as well. I suppose if I use a lot of paint, it should be able to cover the paper like this. But you have to use like a lot of paint. And this is the rollerball gel pen again. The gouache is almost dry now, so let's take a closer look. Now I have a lot of paint here, so the gouache, which is opaque, is actually able to cover the paper quite well, and we do not see the weird paper texture. But here on the side wall you can see this is diluted gouache and we can see the weird paper texture. If we move down here you can see more paint, and more paint means it's going to cover the paper, so no weird paper texture here as well. And here we have a lot of paint, and the ink, the rollerball gel ink, actually works quite well on gouache. And by the side here I have also painted some gouache. This is a lot of paint, so it is able to cover the paper and hide the weird paper texture here as well. And here with this blue you can see this part is concentrated, so we don't see the weird paper texture, but this part is diluted and we see that weird paper texture. And lastly, we have crayons. And this is actually the Caran d'Ache Neo Color water-resistant wax pastels. So this is dry media, and obviously it is going to work well. So these are the results. Since the paper can no longer handle water media well, it's best to use dry media on the paper. You can use gouache as long as you use enough paint to cover the paper texture. Gel ink works. Liquid ink does not work. Alcohol markers do not work well, and you shouldn't use alcohol markers with watercolor paper because the paper is going to soak the ink and use up the ink really quickly. Paint markers will work, such as Posca markers or oil-based markers. So going forward, I may just use this sketchbook with colored pencils or maybe gouache with some paint markers.